first as a deputy chairman of India's Planning Commission from 2004 to 2014, 10 years as a deputy chairman of India Planning Commission. He led 2 successive 5-year plans that focused on achieving faster, more inclusive, and sustainable growth. He also served in senior capacities such as Finance Secretary and Economic Advisor, and earlier in his career, he held positions at the World Bank and the IMF, including as the first director of the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office that was set up, and he was the first director in this institutional arrangement. His distinguished service and intellectual leadership have earned him many accolades, including the Padma Vibhushan, one of India's highest civilian honors. In recent years, Dr. Ahluwalia has been deeply engaged in themes that are directly relevant to Sri Lanka's political context, managing economic reforms under complex political and economic conditions, integrating climate and sustainability consideration into national planning, and aligning growth strategies with shifting global dynamics. His insights will therefore be valuable as we deliberate on Sri Lanka's our own growth path. Ladies and gentlemen, by the end of today's discussion, I hope we will gain a new perspectives on how Sri Lanka can build on recent stabilization efforts, pursue growth model that is resilient, inclusive, and forward-looking based on his vision and thinking. It's now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia to deliver the keynote address. Thank you.
Do it from here. Well, thank you, Governor. It's a great honor for me to be invited to be part of the 75th anniversary celebrations of the Central Bank. I've had the pleasure and the privilege of visiting Sri Lanka relatively frequently in recent years. I was here in 2024 and also in 2023, and before that, of course, as a tourist. But I think these recent visits have given me an opportunity to see Sri Lanka responding to the crisis that you faced in 2022. And that was especially interesting for me because I was there in 1991 in India when we faced a crisis, a really serious one. And I've always felt that we should actually study a lot of how neighboring countries face crises. I mean, there's a lot of theory about how you face crises, but most of this theory is derived from a mature economy, whereas actually, from our point of view, we need to know what happened in other developing countries. And I mean, there have been a series of such crises. In 1997, you had the crisis in Southeast Asia. Didn't affect us that much, but it was right next door. And then we've had lots of crises of different kinds. And it's a pleasure to be here. And if you like, when I saw the newspaper this morning, it gives me a reason to congratulate you, Mr. Governor, and your team, because the IMF has expressed a lot of satisfaction at how the stabilization has actually gone. And I know they're quite tough cookies. So if you got them to express satisfaction, that's pretty good. You know, I remember when I was here last year, just before the election, there was a lot of concern about the IMF program. I mean, you were heading into an election, and there was a feeling that, you know, maybe the new government would want to renegotiate the program. And I was asked, what do you think? So I said, look, it's not my business to comment on something that is obviously a political decision. But if you force me, I would say that it's probably not a good idea to immediately ask the government to the IMF to renegotiate the program, because if these fellows have negotiated a program, it's very difficult for them to go back and say, the new government has asked us to renegotiate it, and now we think something completely different. It would be a good idea to continue the program on a sort of best efforts basis, and if things turn out to be difficult, persuade them that circumstances have changed and therefore some modification is necessary. And I'm very glad that that's actually, I mean, the new government did not reject the program. And you can see from what I see in the newspaper today that it's really gone very well. You know, we need to think about why is it that the IMF is viewed as such a terrible thing. I mean, I recall that from my own experience in India, that, you know, there's a great asymmetry between the World Bank and the IMF. I mean, nobody regards anyone, any government as doing the wrong thing if they're borrowing from the World Bank. And the World Bank also specifies all kinds of conditions. But when the IMF is involved, it becomes a highly political issue. And you know, I thought about this, and I often tell people when they ask me this question, that in the public mind, you know, being a member of the World Bank is like joining a health club. I mean, you're not ashamed of it, you're part of it, they recommend all kinds of things that are good for your health, and you do what you can, etc. The IMF is more like a hospital. I mean, you don't say proudly that I've gone into a hospital. You're grateful there should be a hospital. If you need to go, it should be there. So in many ways, the IMF is very crucial. But I think we have to recognize that nobody is quite happy having to go to the hospital, least of all if they've been admitted to it by a preceding government. So, you know, it just struck me, brought back memories in my own case. We knew in 1990 that we would have to go to the IMF. But the government had just changed. The new government had come in under Mr. VP Singh. It was a coalition government and not a very strong one. And at one point, he called me aside and he said that, look, the finance ministry is saying that we should go for an IMF program. And what is your view? I was his economic advisor. I said, sir, if you ask me, the fund is there to help when necessary. We need help. And it's a good idea to get the help early rather than late. So I think the finance ministry is right. You should go for a program. And then he said to me, you know, but it's politically very difficult. So tell me, can I avoid going to the IMF? What can I do to avoid going to the IMF? And I said, look, of course you can avoid going to the IMF if you take a whole lot of corrective measures, much stronger than what the IMF would propose. Because in the absence of the IMF certifying that it is happy with these measures, you will have to convince a lot of markets who on the whole are quite suspicious, and you can only convince them if you do more than what the IMF would require you to do. So actually what the IMF is doing is buying you time. You go to the IMF, you have to do some things. It gives you more time to do them. During that time, you get some money. And if you really want to avoid going to the IMF, and you know you can never rule out an absolute political compulsion, the only way of avoiding them and actually manage the crisis if you do twice as many things as what the IMF would like. But of course, he thought about that, but his government fell shortly thereafter. It was a politically highly unstable situation. And so we went to the IMF under the next but one government. And I think that at that time, it was made very clear to the Prime Minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, who brought in Mr. Montek Singh, who had been a former central bank governor and also a former deputy chairman of our planning commission and one-time finance secretary also. So he said, look, we are in a crisis. You have to take charge and make sure that it's fixed. And so what Dr. Montek Singh said to Mr. Narasimha Rao is that, look, that crisis can be fixed, but it's going to be politically very difficult for you. And this interaction between economics and politics is actually central in any real-world situation. And what Mr. Narasimha Rao, what Dr. Montek Singh told me, Mr. Narasimha Rao had said to him, and I put this in my book Backstage. He said, look, you do what you think has to be done and leave the politics to me. If you succeed, we'll share the credit. And if you fail, you'll get the blame. And I thought that was a very fair distribution of risks and burdens. And I think Dr. Montek Singh understood that. We were lucky things went very well. We got out of the crisis, and also it started a long period of growth. And in a way, Sri Lanka is in that stage right now where you've done the stabilization and you've done well. I mean, growth has come back to positive, the current account balance is suddenly positive, fiscal deficits come down quite a bit, the IMF is happy. But you know, stabilizing the economy is one thing. The real objective needs to be, how do you get back to some kind of sustainable and equitable growth process? And that's really what lies ahead. And that requires many, many things. But I have to mention that Sri Lanka faces exceptionally difficult circumstances because we all face difficult circumstances. India in 1991 was lucky because we had mucked up the system. The system reacted with a crisis. The rest of the world was fine. I mean, there was no problems in the rest of the world. Growth was going on. Globalization was proceeding. So all that India had to do was to fix itself. Now, regrettably, Sri Lanka doesn't just have to fix itself. Sri Lanka also has to face a world which is much, much more difficult than it ever has been in the past for all of us. So I want to my lecture is really going to be on why is it difficult, and what does that mean, and what do we have to do. So I think, and then we can, I mean, obviously, in the end, I shall leave it to you to decide what of these things are most important. But the three critical things that I think make life difficult, not just for Sri Lanka, but for everybody, are the following. Number one, there seems to be a policy turnaround in the global economy, where the earlier commitment by the leading economies to maintain an open world trading system with no resort to protectionism, that has clearly weakened. And that change, sometimes called geopolitics, sometimes can be called geoeconomics, that makes for a different kind of world. There are two other things that are independent of that, and they're not based on any policy actions taken by governments. So in that sense, they're exogenous to the world of policy making. Those are, number one is climate change, and number two is the pace and nature of technological change that we are facing. So, I mean, I'll come back to each of these things in sequence, but let me first, therefore, deal with the change in geopolitics or geoeconomics that you see. So for that, if I can have these slides put on, and maybe I can, if I'm clever, actually manage to change them myself. Yup, now let's see. Okay, yeah. So that's just a few slides, 4 slides. The first slide really tells you the share of different categories in world GDP. So I've got 4 categories there. One is clearly the US. That's the black line. Then the green line is the EU. And the red line is China. And the blue line underneath is India. Now, as you can see, the US share has kind of jumped up and down, but its share today in global GDP is not very different from what it was 20 years ago. So it doesn't have any reason for saying that its relative position has been encroached upon. The guys who've really seen a huge erosion of their share are the EU, because their share has considerably come down, and I can't see I don't know if you can, it's kind of come down from 25, it was 30% in 1980, and is now down to about 17%. So that's a very big decline in relative share. China shows a huge increase in share from about 1.6 or something to close to 15% or so. And India is right at the bottom as blue. I mean, we're doing better than we used to. We're doing better than other emerging market countries, so our share has gone up. But we're not in the league of threatening anybody, just sort of doing a little bit better, so that's where we are. Now, you know, normally you would think that the US should not feel too threatened by this development. If anybody should feel threatened, it's really the EU. But as a matter of fact, it's the US that has felt threatened. And I think the reason they felt threatened is that China has made it plain in policy statements that they're not just seeing an increase in share, which is fine. I mean, after all, they're still a relatively moderate per capita income level. Their per capita income is much below the US and EU. It's just the numbers that are large, so that their share has gone up. But what they have said is, officially said, that they intend to challenge the United States, both in technological terms, in economic terms, and in terms of the sort of system of governance. You know, in other words, what is the model that you hold up to the rest of the world? So obviously, the US observing that threat do feel a little bit challenged. Now here's a somewhat different chart. This is this is the chart which describes what's happening to the share of world trade. I mean, the first one was the share of GDP. This one is share of world trade. Now here it's quite interesting that you have the US and China. China, in terms of share of world trade, has actually gone over the US now, although somewhat coming down. Now the EU is very, very high. But actually that is because a lot of the trade within the EU is counted as exports. If you treat the EU as exports from the EU to the rest of the world, then you get to the dotted green line. And actually these three are roughly at the same kind of level from that perspective. And of course India is much below. So that's what's happening on that front. I mean, the other interesting thing is that people think of investment as the basis of growth. And you can clearly see that the red line, which shows Chinese investment as a share of GDP, I mean, it was higher, but it's still at the level of about 40% or so. India is in the middle, i.e. the blue line, 30% or so. And the US and EU are sort of at the lower level of about 20 or something like that. So those numbers give a sense that if you have China growing with an investment rate of 40%, whereas let's say EU and US are only at about 20, the chances are that growth will be much higher in China than in the US and EU, so they're that concerned. But that depends a bit on how the Chinese get over their present problem, because they have a series of problems which, depending on the view you take, either their growth rate is going to get permanently restrained or they'll be able to overcome these things. I just want to make one other point, and that is that I've mentioned China here, India here at 30%. And I think from our point of view, I mean, if we need to be a little better than we are, so 35, etc. If we want to grow at 7%, 8%, and so on, then this is not good enough. We need to do better. In my view, I don't think China needs to invest 40% in order to get the growth rate that they're capable of getting now. So I think there's a bit of overinvestment there. That overinvestment, by the way, will have an impact on world trade, because in the past, the Chinese overinvestment has been absorbed because they've been able to export huge amounts to the rest of the world. Now, if the rest of the world decides to shut down on these exports, then I think that will become a bit of a problem. And other developing countries are sort of, you can see here, a series of other countries have been brought in, Turkey, Indonesia, etc. Many of them are around the India level. Brazil is much, much lower. Actually, in this, Sri Lanka is sort of near the EU-US 20% or thereabout, which is not a bad investment rate, but even for Sri Lanka, if you want to get back to a 6% or a 7% growth rate, you'll have to invest more than 20%. So what was the policy change that this provoked? You know, in the Biden administration, the threat of China was perceived as a conscious threat to the position of the United States. And so the Biden administration adopted a sort of singling out China and ring-fencing it type of approach. They called it the small yard, high fence. In other words, a small area for protection, but a high protection. So that many of these new technologies, semiconductors, etc., they would not allow to go to China. They became concerned, in their view, that China was not observing intellectual property rights protections, etc., etc. So their whole approach was that, look, we cannot treat China like any other country, and that's a violation of the WTO rules. The WTO rules say that, look, you should be, for any member of the WTO, you should be treating them like everybody else. So they consciously departed from that. But of course, under WTO, you can do practically whatever you want on security grounds. So they invoked security. And that was the position. I think the difference in the Trump administration is that their analysis is not that China is the only problem. They do think China is a problem. They somehow have come to the conclusion that the whole world is discriminating against the US, and that this discriminatory action needs to be countered, and all these reciprocal tariffs, etc., that they have invented, they picked a large number of countries, and I think it's well known that the theoretical basis of the argument that they are making, if you have a trade surplus vis-a-vis the US, that somehow you are an unfair trader. I mean, this is totally wrong. But whatever it is, that's what they've done. So essentially, they've levied a lot of tariffs on whoever they have a trade deficit with. Now remember, the US was historically, they were the market for the rest of the world. So they're invariably importing things from countries rather than exporting to them. And what they're exporting to them is really intellectual property which gets embedded in other people's exports. So, you know, in the EU, for example, if you do a calculation, the trade balance of the EU versus the US on goods trade shows that the EU has a surplus vis-a-vis the United States, which is why President Trump has imposed these reciprocal tariffs on the EU. But if you do a composite calculation of goods and services, it's almost balanced. So there's no logic in sort of looking at goods and not looking at services. But that's neither here nor there. That's what the US has done. And I think most countries have allowed the US to do it simply because it's a very important partner for everybody. It's an important partner for us. So while nobody likes the system, they're not, by and large, not retaliating. They're just trying to negotiate their way out of it, which I think is actually sensible. And we have no idea what these negotiations will lead to. So actually, at the moment, it is not very clear what will happen to the US tariffs. And therefore, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to world trade. It's quite clear that world trade will be adversely affected, but how much it will be adversely affected is at the moment uncertain. So this is relevant for Sri Lanka also, because I don't think Sri Lanka has been hit by exceptionally negative action directed at Sri Lanka. But to the extent to which all this action leads to a slower growth rate of world trade, clearly Sri Lanka will be affected in the sense that either exports will be less than they otherwise would be, or we'll have to see what can be done. So that's a big question mark, and that's an issue. I don't think we can do very much about it, but I simply mention this to say that this is a cause of a huge amount of uncertainty. And this uncertainty doesn't just affect exports. It's also uncertainty that affects investment flows. So countries that are trying to attract investment flows will be wondering if somebody is going to invest in a developing country because they expect that that country can be a base for exporting to the rest of the world. The uncertainty in American policy will make all these people a little bit uncertain about whether they should proceed or wait until the position is much clearer. So I think we have a significant increase in uncertainty, which will lead to lower FDI, which will have an adverse impact on developing countries. How much, that requires a lot of very detailed analysis. So this is one category of things. The second issue that we need to look at is climate change. Now, I'm sure that all of you have heard all the usual things on climate change. So let me just very briefly say, at least from what I've seen of the literature on India, and some of it would be relevant to Sri Lanka, although these things can be refined so that you go down to what each particular block means. For us, it's very clear that the uncertainty about the monsoons is a very important consequence of climate change. And I would assume that much the same would be true of Sri Lanka also. And when they say uncertainty about the monsoons, it really means that there's a likely greater frequency of both droughts and extreme rainfall. Now, droughts raise all the obvious problems that they normally do, and extreme rainfall leads to major problems depending on where it happens. Certainly in the Himalayan region of India, and maybe in some of the highlands here, that would be a problem. It can lead to landslides and other kind of damage. You can counter this damage. It also, the uncertainty about water availability requires us to do more in order to conserve the water. The dangers of floods, which would otherwise cause a huge amount of damage in urban areas, requires us to take countermeasures. All of these countermeasures are expensive, and they will have an impact on the fiscal situation. They're also more difficult to implement, or it's more difficult for politicians to sell it to the public. Because it's like saying to the public that, listen, if we don't do this, we're likely to be hit either 5 years or 10 years down the road with a much worse outcome. And it's not easy to persuade people to pay for something which is worth it because it prevents negative effects 10 years down the road. Because people, particularly at lower income groups where perhaps their degree of information available to them or knowledge is also lower, it's not very easy to convince people that this is absolutely top priority measure to implement. And certainly in India, that is known to be the fact. When you talk to politicians, they understand this, but they also understand that their resources are limited. They don't want to pay for this by withdrawing subsidies. They don't want to pay for this by raising taxes. And they don't want to pay for this by cutting other capital expenditure, which people have come to expect. So, it's one of those, it's like the president of the European Commission who said to one economist who was lecturing him on what to do, that, we all know what we have to do, we just don't know how to get elected after we've done it. And this is really the biggest problem with climate change. People know what is necessary, but it's not so easy to sell to the public. Now, there have been many estimates made in different countries that what is the additional expenditure that you need to do in order to, as it were, suitably address the threat of climate change. I've not read anything specifically on Sri Lanka, but in India, between 1% and 2% of GDP, they routinely say is really what you need. Now, the way they would put it, I said we are investing 30% of GDP. I said we need to raise this to 34% in order to get to 7 or 8% growth. But they would say in addition to that, you have to do 2% of GDP just to prevent the damage that you might get from climate change. So as you can see, that ends up by being a very tall order. And my guess is that in Sri Lanka also, you'd have similar, somewhere between 1% and 2% of GDP is the cost of actually dealing with climate change if you want to avoid the negative effects of climate change in future. I'll come back. I think what this boils down to is really how important is the fiscal deficit. And I think this is something that one must keep in mind. that, traditionally, in the old days, whenever crisis situation arose, the IMF would say, cut the fiscal deficit. In fact, the joke in those days was that IMF stands for it's mainly fiscal. So, this is before the Washington Consensus, when they sort of recognize, well, it's fiscal, there's also trade policy, also market efficiency, privatization, a whole lot of decontrol, etc. So from it's mainly fiscal, we move to these other things. But even in the Washington Consensus, maintaining a macro balance as a precondition for the success of other market-led reforms was an absolutely central thing. So everybody recognized that it's not just fiscal. I mean, if you go and fix the fiscal situation in the sense of the fiscal deficit, you could do that by probably having the wrong kind of taxes or cutting the wrong kind of expenditures. But either way, you'd get a low fiscal deficit. That's not good enough because it's not very efficient. You have to do it along with lots of other things. That's really what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s. And in India in 1991, we were quite aware of this. And that's why we had a whole lot of other reforms along with the classic crisis management reform. And therefore, in Sri Lanka, looking ahead, and you will be discussing this with the IMF for another 2 years. I think the program continues for 2 more years. I'll have some comments on that later. But the whole climate change thing involves a clear identification of what is it that has to be done. And a lot of it has to be done in terms of damage prevention. Some of it has to be done in terms of decarbonization. And decarbonization really means moving away from coal-based power generation to renewable generation, solar and wind. Sri Lanka is quite well positioned for wind generation. I'll have some comments to make on that later on. Let me now, just since time is running out and I do want to leave some time for questions, the third item on the agenda, which makes life more difficult in future, is technological change. Now, we've been having technological change since human beings began. But most technological change has taken place relatively slowly. What we are now seeing is a kind of foundational technology change. I mean, Industry 4.0 and the rise of the internet and the digital economy has created a foundationally different kind of technology. It's a little bit like the move away from steam power to electricity. Everything has to be done differently once you bring in electricity. So I think many of these things that are associated with AI, and AI is now there in every little way, they are foundational. And the thing one has to recognize is that the pace of this change is much faster than what we've seen before. I mean, forever we've had these arguments that, technological change will displace employment because you'll need less people to do what you want to do because technology has improved. But by itself, that's a good thing, an increase in productivity. But of course, people used to worry what's going to happen to the labor that was employed with the old technology. And the argument was that, look, technology will bring in so many other things that new jobs will come and they will take care of providing labor. And that, by and large, has happened, certainly for the last 200 or 300 years, that all the worry about new technology was ultimately proved to be not valid because new jobs did come up. I think this time around, the change is that the pace at which technology is moving is much faster than ever before. I mean, you must have seen all these numbers, that it took 75 years for the automobile to reach 100 million users, and it took 20 years for TV to reach 100 million users, and it took, 5 years for the internet to reach 100 million users, and in the case of ChatGPT, it took 2 months. So, if you're now going to see change at a pace that we've not seen before, and I'm not an AI guy, but I read this stuff occasionally. Everybody tells me that the pace of change that you can expect in AI is something that we don't actually fully understand, because it's changing so rapidly that virtually if somebody were to write what are the important models people should think about today and wrote the same thing a year from now, it would be quite different. So I think, what does this mean? What this means is that systems adjust, but when the change is gradual, systems find it easier to adjust. But when the change is that rapid, you have to be either very, very efficient in the system, or you create a certain amount of dislocation and distortion. And I think that's pretty much what I think people think is going to happen. It is true. For example, I'm giving you an India-type example, and I'm sure that it will resonate with you because there would be similar things in Sri Lanka. I mean, for example, call offices, the sort of remote handling of customer problems. This is more or less going to disappear because chatbots will take care of the whole thing. That means a lot of jobs for our country. The people who used to sit on a board and answer questions and so on. Our country means India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, not so much Malaysia, the Philippines certainly, and so on. And I think, for example, in coding, in the software area, low-level coding is simply going to be done by AI. I mean, the first stage of coding is going to be done by AI, and the higher level software guys will look at it to see if they've got it right. This is already happening in things like research assistant work. I mean, if you are writing a paper on something, in the old days you would have a research assistant, and you would tell them, well, look, there's this thing and that thing, and you check it out and summarize the whole thing. Now you don't do that. You just go to ChatGPT and say, tell me what's the latest on something, and it produces something. Now, by the way, that something is, I mean, I do this myself, so that something is not always correct. And sometimes when I'm asking a question on something I know something about, I can see that it's wrong. So I say, but surely this is not correct. And very sweetly, ChatGPT say, oh yeah, Montek, thanks for pointing that out. And then, it gives you the correct answer. So there is a probability that they get it wrong, but there's no doubt that people will use it big time. And certainly in India, we are finding that many of our IT firms have scaled down new hires. Now, scaling down new hires creates a real problem because, I mean, young people today are quite aspirational. They're graduating from whatever it is, and suddenly not enough companies are coming for campus recruitment. So for them, it's a real disaster. Fortunately, most of them come from families where, I mean, they have a resilience capability. They don't starve. But, for a young person who's dreamt of getting a job at a certain age and finds that that doesn't happen, then this can be very disturbing. And this is not just in India. This is happening in America too. I mean, all the data from the United States tells you that young graduates are finding it very difficult to get jobs. Placements are reduced, waiting times have gone up, etc. So we have to recognize that this will happen. Now, there are two ways in which we could respond. I'm saying we, in the sense I've thought about it for India, and I'm assuming that it's also relevant for Sri Lanka, and you can decide for yourself whether it's relevant or not. But if your one kind of reaction will be, we should regulate this new technology. If it's going to prevent employment, don't allow it. I think this would be completely wrong, simply because you cannot stop, if it's in a global economy, if you don't allow it and nobody wants the call centers, it's not as if they won't stop the call centers. That'll happen anyway. So it's a bit like saying, stop the world, I want to get off. It's just not feasible. I think we have to recognize that these technologies are there, and that they will come, and they will have a disruptive effect, and we have to ask ourselves, what can we do about it? Well, one thing we can do about it is to promote AI in many areas where it will create new jobs. And I think that is there's much more scope for that than we've thought about. I mean, for example, in education, AI allows you to give a much more student-oriented, personalized education. I mean, if you're teaching people maths, and this is happening in India where, I mean, in India, parents who want their children to do well routinely resort to tutoring because they don't really believe that the school is going to give a good enough education. But what's happening now is that amongst the tutoring groups, they're resorting to more AI in the sense that instead of setting kids a maths test and then seeing how well they're doing and then correcting them, they're setting them what are in fact computer design tests, and those tests kind of judge what the weakness of the student is. And therefore, the next round of questions is geared towards taking care of those weaknesses by focusing on that area and making the question a little simpler. This helps the tutor identify how exactly to build up the strength of the student. In this way, you could have a system where altogether new ways of dealing with problems get thrown up. I mean, one obvious thing that a lot of companies are doing is that how do you treat the HR problem? I mean, you advertise for 10 vacancies and you get 2,500 applicants. So your objective is to screen those applicants down from 2,500 to maybe 100, so you can interview the 100 that are most suited to you. And that 100 most suited to you are not the ones who got the highest marks, because if that was the case, there'd be no problem. So what you do is you have these programs where people submit their CVs, and the program, you tell the program what you're looking for, and the program applies artificial intelligence to judge which are the 100 most suited to you. Now, there are huge ethical problems that are raised because all these programs are biased. I think in the United States, they discovered that when they were using such an HR program, the bias in the program was that it tended to promote candidates who got interviewed. If they were interviewed, as it were, online, and they were showing themselves being interviewed, if the background was a bookshelf, you're more likely to be picked up. And that's because, more intellectual-oriented fellows had bookshelves, and so the AI had worked out based on past experience that this is the kind of characteristic associated with candidates who win, which actually was not relevant, but they got picked up. So you'll have the following problem. In all probability, it will choose 100 pretty good candidates, but 2 or 3 of those may not actually be strictly deserving to be in that 100. Now, as a company, I mean, are you going to scrutinize each application, or are you going to say, look, I'll live with that error and work it out later? So these are just a few examples of new things that can be done by AI, and we need to be able to, inform our employers of how to use AI. Most of all, we need to be able to, educate our kids so that they're able to take to AI. And increasingly, what companies say is that if they want somebody who fits in, who's comfortable with AI. They're not talking about developing new AI, just comfortable with using it. Now, maybe we need to have something in our school program that makes kids comfortable with AI. I'm just giving 1 or 2 examples. But the whole issue of skilling for the future needs to take into account what we can do on the AI front. So these are three, if you like, problems that Sri Lanka faces. One, the policy-induced one, is the global structure changing too much? My view on that, by the way, is that I don't think it's changing as much as people think. It's true that the United States is behaving very differently. But I think the rest of the world, up to now, although they're dealing with the US on its own terms, and therefore it may seem that they're willing to accept whatever the US is doing, they themselves are remaining open and wanting to trade on the basis of well-known rules of trade. In India, for example, we've signed an FTA with the UK, we're negotiating one with the EU, and the minister concerned keeps saying he's very hopeful, let's see what happens. And I personally feel that we should be signing an agreement with the East Asians also, and the most obvious one is the CPTPP. That doesn't include China, but it does include the other major Asian countries. And EU has joined that agreement. So I think this is something that Sri Lanka might want to consider, that in future, I would hope, of course, that India is a logical FTA for Sri Lanka. If we have an FTA, it could probably be deepened. I think there could be much more business between India and Sri Lanka than there is. And there's no reason why that shouldn't happen, including tourism, etc. So I think in the whole world, I think there's still a chance that the whole world will remain wedded to an open trading system with some rules. May not be WTO, but be something WTO minus. And I think we should protect that. And with a bit of luck, the United States also, in due course, might come around to realizing that that's the way to go. You know, at the moment, I don't think there's much sign of change in the US at the moment, partly because the US economy has done better than many people thought it would after these negative tariffs. The reason for that is not that the tariffs are not a problem. The reason for that is that the investment in AI in the US is absolutely humongous. I mean, there is an incredible boom of investments in AI, which is keeping the economy going. A lot of the positive signs in the US stock market, etc., is really due to what has happened to these 5 firms. So, I mean, it's an open question. Of course, if this turns out to be the solution, all these bets are correct, etc., then the buoyancy may continue. But if it turns out to be a bubble, as some people say, then I think we'll begin to see some negative effects. So I'm hoping that the US will realize that its approach to trade policy is poorly conceived, and maybe if the rest of the world gives the signal that, look, we're quite open, and we're willing to be open, then I think they will themselves want to join. And given that how important they are, everybody would be quite happy to have them come in. So they have the exorbitant privilege of sort of rejecting the world to begin with and be happily accepted by the world as soon as they're ready to join. So that's a factual thing on trade. On climate change, I think really it is important to get going on the search for renewable energy. And from what I know, I mean, in a way, this is an area where India and Sri Lanka have much to share with each other. I mean, you have a huge amount of wind power potential offshore. I'm sure that there are private investors in India who want to invest in it. We need to build up a grid connectivity, which is useful between India and Sri Lanka anyway. Because, I mean, if there is an electricity market, each country should be able to meet its surpluses and deficits by trading across borders in electricity. And I think we should think of doing that. And of course, in many other areas, there are possibilities of making further progress. And on the technology front, I think what we need is a serious effort at pushing the the injection of AI where it can raise productivity. And having said that, let me add that associated with that is the very serious danger of cyber fraud. In the central bank, I don't have to sensitize you. I know that our central bank is very concerned about it, because in the end, the banking industry is the one industry that's easiest to digitize. And I think we've had a lot of success in that. I'm sure you're doing the same thing. Making payments across people just through your mobile phones is now very easy. But that very same ease also opens us up to similar kind of cyber frauds. And I think we need to have much more attention to it, maybe than we do. Well, that's a rough idea, but I would just want to conclude by drawing your, Governor 𝐿 Singh and I were in something called the 𝐾𝐞𝐜𝐿 conference in Delhi. And at the 𝐾𝐞𝐜𝐿 conference, Andres Velasco from the LSE, I don't know if you attended his session, but he made a presentation of what they call the London Consensus. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Washington Consensus had become a basis for laying down what were felt to be good rules for economic policy making. They led to a lot of criticism because they were felt to be, too much fitting one common rule, cookie-cutter approach, the same, some recommendation is good for all countries, rather than tailoring it to circumstances. And I think the London Consensus is a book that is about to be released in London, which they've collected about 50 people to put together something of an alternative to the Washington Consensus. And the alternative is, it's a set, not a set of specific recommendations, but a set of principles which should guide how do you get to specific recommendations. And that actually introduces aspects which countries that deal with the IMF will find quite useful, because it's making the point that, look, yes, fiscal deficits are important, but the quality of the fiscal deficit is also important. Making the point that you can't just sort of talk about deregulation. You've got to talk about reducing regulation while building state capacity. So the idea that leaving everything to the market is going to solve all problems is not correct. You want the market to function in a way in which equitable outcomes are assured. Then how do you do that? This London Consensus is supposed to provide a guide. I hope that you will tell the Sri Lanka's executive director and alternate executive director to have the IMF board discuss this London Consensus to see does it have any implications for IMF policy. I'm quite sure that the IMF staff will say, yes, we have taken all this into account. That will still be useful, because I think in due course, as you run into, I can easily see that as you run into particular problems negotiating with the IMF, having the IMF board look at the London Consensus and pronounce on it would be a good thing. And I don't know how readily available it is. I haven't seen a copy yet in Delhi, but they tell me it's coming. I'm certainly going to get a copy. And it would be a good idea for the central bank to actually do a critical review of it for your bank magazine to make more people aware of what's happening. So with those words, let me thank you for the invitation to speak. It's a great honor and gave me another opportunity to visit Sri Lanka, which I greatly value. And thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahluwalia, for that insightful presentation. We will now proceed with the Q&A session. If you have any questions or would like to seek clarifications from Dr. Ahluwalia, You can raise your hand so one of our colleagues will come to you with a microphone.
Dr. Ahluwalia, thank you so much for being here and for that insightful lecture. Just a quick question. So you outlined 3 issues today. Just wanted to ask you, so last week, the week before, I think, RBI has put out a paper about improvement in poverty across several states based on the recent HCES data. I know you have a long stint of working on poverty data as well. But against that backdrop, how do you see India, I mean, with these achievements under its belt, you're also advocating for about 7+% growth for India in the upcoming years. How prepared is India to tackle these issues while also balancing out issues relating to poverty and inequality? Thank you.
That's a very, very good and very tough question. Actually, we're totally prepared. I mean, there's complete consensus, and the country will be very happy if we get 7 or 8% growth. What we are not prepared is a consensus on what we have to do in order to get 7 to 8%. I mean, let me give you a simple, take for example, climate change, okay? We want to move towards renewable energy, and we are making quite a few efforts there. Now, 2 issues come up. First, what's going to be the policy towards carbon taxation? I mean, if you're willing to have carbon taxation, you will automatically force people to go into renewable energy. We don't seem to be willing to have carbon taxation. So what we're doing is we're imposing limits on the distribution companies that you must buy X% of your energy from renewables. Now, it actually raises the cost, so it has the same effect as a carbon tax, but, you know, politicians like it because it's indirect, okay? But the problem is that it's only as good as the penalty for not meeting that obligation. And that penalty at the moment is quite small. So, you know, if you're serious about increasing the percentage of reliance on renewable energy in line with our own medium-term, long-term objectives, then either we'll have to push this much harder, and the resistance will come when you push. I think there's another issue that's very crucial. As you move into renewable energy, okay, you're going to move to an energy source that is variable. The supply isn't flat like a base load. Now, if it's variable, then you need batteries, you need pump storage, you can even things off a bit. But broadly, you cannot even it out completely. So the logical thing is that price should be dynamic. Intraday variation in prices. Now, people are quite prepared to do that for industry, but they're not prepared to do it for households. I think, unfortunately, you know, we're running a politics in which too many prices have been politicized. And if you're going to politicize a price, then either you're going to ruin the economy, or you must have a fiscal capacity to meet that price target without damaging the economy. And I'm not sure that, well, I'm sure that we haven't worked that out. But the good news is that there's a lot of pressure, a lot of movements, and, you know, as we discovered in our own reform program, it's theoretically nice to say we plan out a program. What is actually true is you kick the system in 1 or 2 critical areas and then see whether it performs. It never performs all the way to scale. But if you do enough, it will respond. The ability of systems to respond is greatly underestimated, in my view. But I can't say that we are well on the way to doing that. I mean, take a simple thing like water. I mean, you know, everything you hear about water in India suggests that, you know, water will become scarce. But we are spending more, I mean, in Maharashtra, 80% of the irrigation goes to sugarcane. From an economic point of view, it doesn't make any sense. But the whole politics of Maharashtra revolves around sugarcane mills. So if you talk to any politician in Maharashtra, by definition, they're in favor of the sugar industry. So, you know, I suspect that these are very long-term targets that we have to achieve. And the number of things we have to do is quite large. And if you decide, if you make a list of all of them, you'd be quickly disillusioned. So I think the critical thing is that somebody should say, look, I have to do a whole lot of things, and I'll try my best. But in the next 5 years, these 3 things I must do, and then build a political pressure to get those things done. That's what I found in the reforms that earlier we were doing was helpful. Narrow down something, but let other things flow with the tide, as it were. Your central question, really, I'm not able to answer. Are we going to be able to do that? I don't know. But you know, these are so important that there's no harm for somebody like me who's an outsider saying, look, I don't know. Today, we've declared our long-term objectives. We want to become a developed country. That's wonderful. But if somebody were to say, what are the 25 things you're going to do in the next 5 years, then I think you'll find there's not enough agreement. Are we going to shut down loss-making public sector enterprises? No. Do we want to have labor flexibility? No. So, you know, that's the problem.
So if I can take the liberty to just ask one more follow-up question, please, the audience, to bear with me. So in your book, so since you spoke about reforms and, you know, the commitment to reform, so in Backstage, you refer to the gradualist approach versus, you know, reform by stealth. So in the book, you advocate for the gradualist approach that, you know, Prime Minister Montek Singh had also taken. Has your stance changed, considering that, you know, there are so many challenges, there's so much of opposition coming up? Your stance in relation to the gradualist versus reform by stealth approach, has it changed?
Very good question. No, actually, my idea there was that, you know, gradualism requires you to come clean, but to say we're going to do it over 5 years and not now, okay? But I think the way politics works, nobody is willing to come clean on something that is not politically, nobody thinks that this is politically difficult, but don't worry, I'll do it in 5 years. They say, if it's politically difficult, why are you talking about it now? You know? So the political compulsion is, let's push a couple of things which we can do now and get it done. And then the other things we'll do as we go. I have no problem with that, but if you then selectively identify that, look, did you really, in the last 2 years, have you made strategic progress in certain areas which will stand you in good stead? And I think, I mean, in a way, in India, the GST is an example. As a concept, is very good. The way it was done, I don't think was very good. It took a long time to reduce the number of rates. I'm not myself clear that I think the lowest rate is too low. But you know, the fellows who want to defend this would say, look here, isn't it better than not having had it at all? So in one sense, the GST is there. Now it's going to be somebody's job to tell the government, the country, that look, 5% rate for the lowest rate is too low, so we're going to raise it to 8%. My guess is they'll be able to do it, you know, at a pinch. But I think what is not possible is to lay down an entire list of things, because when you do that, you only give you're inviting the opposition to team up. They all get up and say, this is terrible. So I think Narasimha Rao was very much in favor of reforms by stealth, that you have these in your mind, but when you get a chance, you do it, you know. It doesn't appeal to an engineering person. It doesn't appeal to a planning person, because it seems like, you know, a little too much of a kind of informal approach. But in practice, it may well be what has to be done.
Dr. Ahluwalia, thank you for your very insightful remarks, and we hope we hear many more of those annually in Sri Lanka, continue the trend of the last few years. My question relates to your first out of the 3 buckets. When India, as you rightly mentioned, when India went through that reform program, it was a very fortuitous set of global circumstances in the sense that it was a stable global economic governance environment. We had a unipolar, US hegemon. Institutions like the MDBs were fairly well respected and so on, whereas now it's not the case. My question is, what are your views on the future of global economic governance at a time, yes, you mentioned the London Consensus, which set of principles, but we're seeing whether it's G20, whether it's BRICS, whether it's more regional blocs, is this inevitable? Is this a threat to multilateralism, and we prefer multilateralism? And for countries in our part of the world, what prospects do we have in a world where global economic governance is much more fragmented than it was 20, 30 years ago?
Well, yeah, on global governance, I must say that no easy solutions, but I would say that I think amongst the countries that really matter, with the exception of the US at the moment, most of them believe that, look, we do need some agreed rules by which we conduct ourselves, which means that, just because you don't like a country, you don't kind of do whatever you have to do. And I think there would be a significant amount of support for that. As I said, India has signed an agreement with the UK. We're negotiating, I believe we are at a very advanced stage of negotiating something with the EU. If we do sign one with the EU, then what it does mean is that India is willing to offer for 95% of the items, 95, zero duty. Maybe the zero comes not immediately, but over a 4-year period or a 5-year period. I mean, that's an example of gradualism. I think the EU is interested in signing such an agreement, which also suggests that they are not adopting the same approach that the US is adopting on trade. I mean, they recognize that, look, we need countries to abide by certain either multilateral or plurilaterally agreed rules. Multilateral in this context means under the WTO. And I think that many people have, particularly amongst the West, become a little allergic to WTO. We are not, but we have to recognize that if the message we're getting from them is that, look, you want a free trade agreement, that's fine, but you can't sort of do it under WTO rules. I think one of the things under WTO rules is that, if you can have a free trade agreement, but if any country wants to join, you have to allow them to join. And I don't think many of these countries are happy with that. Like, for example, the Europeans may not be happy to include China for whatever political reasons. So my feeling is that we should tie up agreed trade rules amongst major trading companies, whether they are born within the WTO framework or within a more plurilateral framework. Plurilateral is kind of multilateral, but the technical term multilateral, I think, applies to applying the WTO standards. So I feel that that's one thing. Now, you mentioned BRICS and G20. G20 was meant to be an important forum, okay? It's not, I think the next meeting of the G20 will be in South Africa. I'm not aware of the latest developments, but a lot of people said at one point that perhaps President Trump may not go to the G20 in South Africa. I hope that that's not correct, because remember, the next G20 is in America. So maybe people will persuade him that, look, even if you don't like the G20, you can disagree with the communiqué, but please go. Separately, he seems to have signaled that he likes the G7, but he has announced as of yesterday that maybe we should expand the G7 to include Russia and China. Now, I don't think the Europeans would be happy with that. But I get the impression that even Trump is taking the view that, look, if you want to get global consensus, you've got to get some guys together. So somewhere between a G7 plus and a G20, you're more likely to get progress. BRICS is outside the mainstream It's a convening group. I mean, countries, they don't actually agree on anything which binds each country, but it's just, hearing each other out and that kind of thing. Otherwise, all the important BRICS countries are actually part of the G20. So, the G20's origins are quite connected with this part of the world, because when the East Asian crisis happened in 1997, everybody said that, look, the IMF has failed, but we must have a way we can discuss what kind of a global financial architecture do we want. So the Americans convened a group of 35 countries or something like that in the Willard Hotel. And the original idea was that, look, all the IMF countries, the executive board, the countries that have seats on the executive board, they're all members of the IMF governing board. So why do you need another group? But the feeling was that the IMF governing board, the secretariat is the IMF staff. And after the East Asians just lost faith in the IMF at that point. So the Americans set up a kind of an informal group of 35 countries, which used to meet a couple of years. And then at that point, the Canadians proposed to them that, look, these ad hoc meetings are no good. Let's have a G20. I think the main reason the Canadians moved this, some Canadian friend told me, was that the Canadian finance minister was shrewdly aware that this way he would make Canada a member of the group. Otherwise, if he left it to some other grouping, maybe Canada would be and maybe Canada wouldn't be. But anyway, Canada moved that proposal and the G20 was formed. And then it was George Bush who elevated it to heads of state level in 2008 after the Lehman Brothers crisis. So, it's a idea that came as a head of state group in its origin, the origins being the East Asian crisis. It's worked reasonably well for a long time, but it's not clear whether President Trump will want to continue it. It's interesting that he has said that I think we should add 2 more countries to the G7, in other words, Russia and China. He hasn't said we must make any change in the G20. So I don't know what his intentions are. But if he doesn't go to the G20 in South Africa, the next G20 is in America. So will he take the lead there and convene it or not convene it? Who knows? So it's a very, this whole international thing is very uncertain at the moment. But one thing is very clear. I don't think the majority of countries are happy with a system where you do not have agreed rules of trade, or for that matter, finance. I mean, look, take this simple thing like seizing the assets of a country because you're not happy with them. I mean, for example, whatever the reserves that the Russians held in European banks and in American banks have been frozen. And there's some talk that maybe they should be used to rebuild Ukraine. But the point is that becomes a unilateral act, and that has implications for the future. Because countries will think, do they want their reserves to be kept in an environment where if you have a political problem with that country, all hell to pay. So I'm sure there are people in the US also thinking about this, and maybe in the next year or 2, we will get a clearer picture.
Yes, sir. My name is 𝐿_Nagaraja. I just want to know what's your stance whether we should be continuing with the IMF plan after 2 years when the term ends or not.
You want to come out because at the moment who's speaking?
Yes, my name is Rajkumar. I just want to know what's your stance whether we should be continuing with the IMF plan after 2 years or not.
What after?
Sri Lanka should continue with the IMF after 2 years.
Who will continue?
Sri Lanka when the term ends.
He's asking if Sri Lanka should continue after 2 years.
Oh, I see. No, I mean, I would be too, I'm not adequately either knowledgeable or nor is it appropriate for me to advise. But let me say from our own experience, we were very happy to interrupt the program only on the grounds that it was no longer necessary. So if Sri Lanka is able to say, look, we've restored confidence in Sri Lanka, thank you very much for all the assistance you gave, we are not going to take the next few drawings. If the interruption is on that basis, then you should certainly do it. I don't know whether you mean discontinue because you're not happy with what the program is. Because that always leads to a negative vibe, in the sense that was the IMF, had you agreed to do something and you are now not willing to do it? My own guess, by the way, is that read the London Consensus. It will give you a lot of ways of arguing with the IMF to be a little more flexible on whatever it is that they're talking about. So it's never, I think, a particularly useful thing to interrupt a program except from a position of strength and not as a basis of conflict. In fact, if it's interrupted in a manner in which the IMF itself feels quite happy that they helped Sri Lanka at a critical point, they're very happy that Sri Lanka doesn't need IMF help, and that's good, that's great, wonderful. But at the same time, doing it prematurely doesn't help. The reason I tell you is it's unfortunate, but the rest of the world, because Sri Lanka is a small country, I mean, even India is not such a big country. As you can see, our share of world GDP is not that large, but we are huge in numbers and so on. I think for a small country, there's not enough people who are commenting on the state of the country. And invariably, the IMF becomes the dominant source of informed knowledge about Sri Lanka. So it's important, I think, for the IMF to endorse what Sri Lanka is doing, because many people who would otherwise want to know what is the situation like in Sri Lanka will go to the IMF. So far from what they're saying, you should have no reason to be unhappy with them. But yes, if it turns out that, reserves have accumulated at a terrific rate, current account surplus is high, GDP is picking up, then you can interrupt it, saying, we'll come back to you if we need you, but we don't need you right now. I should, by the way... Only one question. So one more question. Oh. There's one more question there. Oh, okay.
Dr. Ahluwalia, just to deviate from general economics, you mentioned, you touched upon AI and ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. As a senior citizen, having embraced ChatGPT as your newfound friend to facilitate and expedite many things, how would you see that of embracing ChatGPT by the younger generation, whether it would retard their cognitive ability and their thinking? Just want to ask a question.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't get that fully.
Yeah. Many of us as senior citizens embracing ChatGPT has made our life easy because we can save a lot of time.
Yeah.
But how would you see that for younger generation people of making extensive use of ChatGPT, whether it will retard their cognitive abilities?
I don't know. Actually, I mean, I'm the wrong age to pronounce on younger generation. I can tell you that my grandchildren, of whom I'm very fond, the one thing they keep telling me is that Dada means grandfather. Dada, you write such long messages to us on email. These guys, one or two words, an emoji or two, and that's the end of communication. Now, I'm afraid ChatGPT is meant for fellows like me. It gives you a long answer, and if you say, can you expand this to 500 words, they say, yes, of course, I can give you that. So I have a feeling that younger generation, they will be into something totally different. Though I do worry, I think the trivialization of communication through WhatsApp is a serious problem. I think net, I think ChatGPT is a good thing, and on the whole, WhatsApp is not. I use WhatsApp all the time, but I'm just amazed at how many people keep forwarding amusing little clips. So as a result, it has really trivialized political commentary.
Okay, so I think in the interest of time, we have to close the Q&A session. So thank you once again, Dr. Ahluwalia, for your thoughtful responses and further enriching our understanding in this engaging session. Now, to mark Dr. Ahluwalia's presence at Central Bank of Sri Lanka, we have arranged a token of appreciation. I kindly invite the Governor, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, to present the token of appreciation, which will be delivered now to Dr. Ahluwalia. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in extending
lovely.
our sincere appreciation to Dr. Ahluwalia.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And special thank to the Governor also for embracing this session today. As we conclude today's seminar, I'd like to express our sincere appreciation to all of you for joining us today and for active participation. We hope the insights shared today will immensely be helpful in realigning our growth strategy in this dynamic global environment. Finally, I warmly invite all of you to join us for refreshments, which is served outside this hall. And please continue your conversation and networking over a cup of tea. Thank you very much, and have a pleasant day ahead, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.